Blood sprayed across the sand of the Colosseum as Emperor Commodus, wrapped in a lion's skin like Hercules himself, raised his sword over kneeling gladiators. The ruler of Rome was no longer on the throne. He was in the arena, demanding applause like a slave fighter. This wasn't just spectacle. It was Rome's emperor degrading himself before the mob, turning power into blood-soaked entertainment. Most people know the name Commodus from the movie Gladiator, where he's the sniveling villain who murders his own father. But the reality is infinitely more disturbing. He didn't kill his father. The great philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the old emperor, likely died of the plague. But the truth of what Commodus became is a far greater tragedy than any Hollywood script could invent. To understand the monster, you have to first understand the boy, the son of the wisest man in Rome, who was destined to undo everything his father stood for. Born in 161 AD, Lucius Aurelius Commodus was the first emperor in nearly a century to be born to the purple, meaning his father was already emperor when he was born. He was one of 14 children, but tragically, he was the only son to survive into adulthood. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was the last of the 5 good emperors, a man famous for his stoic philosophy and sense of duty. Marcus was a philosopher forced to be a general, a reluctant emperor who spent years on the cold frontiers of the empire defending its borders. He was everything a Roman emperor was supposed to be: dutiful, wise, and self-controlled. And he tried to groom his son to be the same. From a young age, Commodus got the best education money could buy and was immersed in military and government life. He was made Caesar at just 5 years old and, at 16, was named co-emperor alongside his father, a move likely meant to ensure a smooth succession. He even joined his father on grueling military campaigns along the Danube, all to forge him into a worthy leader. But even then, there were signs of trouble. The historian Cassius Dio, who lived through Commodus's reign, said the young heir wasn't naturally evil, but was simple-minded and easily manipulated. He was a coward who preferred pleasure over duty. While his father was contemplating the nature of the cosmos, Commodus was drawn to the easy pleasures of the palace. He had none of his father's work ethic and found the business of running an empire completely boring. Rumors, almost certainly slander spread by his enemies, even claimed he was illegitimate, the son of a gladiator his mother had an affair with. While untrue, the rumor itself shows you the massive gap between the father and the son. For all his wisdom, Marcus Aurelius seems to have been blinded by a father's love. He broke the successful tradition of adopting a proven, capable man as his heir and instead put his faith in his own blood. He saw his son's weaknesses, but hoped a circle of wise advisors could keep him on track. It was a catastrophic mistake. When Marcus Aurelius died in his military camp in 180 AD, the 18-year-old Commodus was left as the absolute master of the Roman world. The age of philosophy was over. The age of iron and rust, as Cassius Dio grimly put it, was about to begin. The new emperor's first act was to abandon his father's life's work. Marcus Aurelius had been on the verge of a huge victory that would have secured the northern frontier for generations. Commodus couldn't have cared less. He wasn't a soldier, and he desperately missed the comforts of Rome. He quickly made a peace treaty that the military and the Senate saw as a total disgrace. But to the war-weary soldiers and the common people, the end of a 14-year conflict was reason to celebrate. Commodus returned to Rome and threw a massive party, ready to be a peacetime emperor who handed out bread and put on circuses. For the first few years, things ran smoothly, mostly because the imperial machine his father had built was still working. Commodus left the boring work of governing to his favorites, like his chamberlain Seodorus and later, the powerful Praetorian prefects Prentius and Cleander. Now, delegating power wasn't unusual, but with Commodus, it became dangerous. He wasn't delegating to focus on strategy. He was delegating so he could have more time for debauchery. He was far more interested in his massive harem of women and young men than in reports from the provinces. He pulled away from politics, and the Senate began to despise him. They saw a lazy emperor who preferred the racetrack to the war room, spending a fortune on himself while his corrupt cronies ran the state. An emperor was supposed to be the first among equals, the embodiment of Roman virtue. From the very beginning, Commodus seemed to embody its every vice. The respect his father had commanded curdled into contempt. The powerful men of Rome started watching him, and they started whispering. Soon, those whispers would turn into a plot, led not by a rival general, but by his own sister. In 182 AD, just 2 years into his reign, the resentment boiled over. The first attempt on his life was a family affair, organized by his older sister, Aeneia Lucilla. Lucilla had once been an empress herself and couldn't stand seeing the honors her brother's wife now received. But it was more than just jealousy. She saw her brother's bizarre behavior and contempt for tradition as a threat to the empire. She was ambitious and believed she and her new husband could do a much better job. The plot was simple. 2 assassins would ambush Commodus as he entered a theater, but it was bungled in the most amateur way possible. As one of the assassins burst from his hiding spot, he didn't just strike. He held up his dagger and yelled, "Here is what the Senate sends to you." That little bit of theater gave the emperor's bodyguards all the time they needed to grab him. The plot fell apart instantly. The consequences were swift and brutal. The assassins were executed. Lucilla, his own sister, was exiled to the island of Capri and killed. A wave of executions followed, targeting anyone Commodus even suspected of being disloyal. This was the turning point. The historian Cassius Dio notes that before this, Commodus was just simple and easily led. After being betrayed by his own sister, he became something else entirely: paranoid, vengeful, and suspicious of everyone. He trusted no one, especially not the Senate. He saw enemies everywhere and retreated into a world of his own making. His Praetorian prefect, Perennis, basically ran the empire until Commodus had him executed for supposedly plotting a coup. His replacement, a freed slave named Cleander, rose to become the most powerful man in Rome, selling public offices to the highest bidder. His corruption got so bad that a mob rioted in 190 AD, demanding his head. Commodus, always a coward, gave the crowd what they wanted and handed Cleander over to be torn to pieces. With every plot, real or imagined, Commodus lost another piece of his sanity. He systematically killed anyone with wealth, power, or a connection to his father. His reign of terror wasn't about grand political purges. It was a petty, vicious, and unpredictable culling of Rome's elite. He was no longer just a bad ruler. He was a tyrant. And as his grip on reality slipped, his ego swelled to divine proportions. He was no longer content to be an emperor. He had to be a god. Rejecting his father's intellectual world, Commodus became obsessed with his own body. He was strong and athletic, and he took special pride in being left-handed. He started building an image of himself not as a statesman, but as a physical titan. And in the Roman world, one figure embodied pure strength above all others: the demigod Hercules. His fascination with Hercules quickly became an all-consuming obsession. He didn't just admire the hero. He started to believe he was Hercules reincarnated. He began appearing in public wearing a lion's skin and carrying a huge club, just like the mythological hero. He ordered statues of himself as Hercules to be put up all over the empire, his face on the hero's muscular body. This wasn't just art. It was a declaration of divinity. As Hercules, he was the son of Jupiter, king of the gods, a status far above any mortal emperor. This megalomania spiraled out of control. He officially renamed Rome, the Eternal City, Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He didn't stop there. He renamed the 12 months of the year, tying them all to his own list of names and titles. August became Commodus, September became Hercules, and so on, creating a calendar of pure narcissism. The Roman legions were renamed Commodiani. The Senate was now the Commodian Fortunate Senate. The senators were forced to play along with this terrifying fantasy. Cassius Dio remembers being forced to chant praises whenever the emperor appeared, hailing him as a god. They had to publicly worship him while privately fearing for their lives. This wasn't just being eccentric, it was a complete shattering of Roman tradition. The emperor was supposed to be the guardian of the state, not its self-proclaimed god. But for Commodus, being a god wasn't enough. He had to prove it. He needed a stage where he could perform his Herculean strength for everyone to see. And in Rome, there was only one stage big enough for a god emperor's debut, the Colosseum. His madness was now complete. He was about to commit the ultimate imperial sacrilege, a disgrace so profound it would scandalize the entire Roman world and seal his fate. The gladiatorial games were the heart of Roman entertainment, but the gladiators themselves were at the very bottom of society. They were slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals, dishonored and disposable. For a freeborn citizen to fight in the arena was a disgrace. For a senator, it was unthinkable. For the emperor, the sacred embodiment of Roman majesty, to do so was an act of supreme degradation. And Commodus loved it. He didn't just host games, he became the star attraction. According to one later, and likely exaggerated history, he fought an incredible 735 times in the arena. He started with beast hunts, but these were no brave contests. Commodus had platforms built so he could shoot animals from a position of complete safety. He was a skilled archer, and the historian Herodian writes that he could shoot the heads off ostriches while they were running at full speed. Cassius Dio, who saw it himself, says Commodus once killed 100 lions in a single day. Dio also tells one particularly bizarre and terrifying story. After slicing the head off an ostrich, Commodus walked over to the senator's section. He held up the bloody head in one hand and his sword in the other, and just grinned, silently gesturing that they were next. The senators, Dio says, were overcome with a hysterical urge to laugh at how absurd it all was. To save themselves, they started chewing on the laurel leaves from their wreaths to hide their laughter behind moving jaws. But the beast hunts were just the warm-up. The main event was Commodus as a gladiator. He'd enter the arena and fight opponents who were either professional gladiators or wounded soldiers. But the fights were a complete sham. They weren't allowed to actually hurt him. They only submitted because they knew he was the emperor, not because he was a better fighter. He would wound them, and of course, he always won. And in a final act of greed, he allegedly charged the Roman treasury a staggering 1 million sesterces for every single appearance, draining the state's coffers to pay himself for his own ridiculous shows. While the common people may have cheered for their gladiator emperor, the elite watched in horror. This was more than just undignified. It was the total inversion of the Roman order. The master of the world was playing the role of a slave. The sacred ruler was covered in sand and blood, begging for cheap applause. He wasn't just neglecting his duties anymore. He was actively defiling the office of emperor. The disgrace was absolute. For those watching from the stands, it was the final proof that he had to go. As 192 AD came to a close, Commodus's megalomania reached its peak. He came up with a plan so outrageous it would be the final straw. He announced that on New Year's Day, 193, he would assume the consulship, Rome's highest office. But he wouldn't do it in the palace, as was tradition. Instead, he would march out of the gladiator barracks, dressed in full armor, and take the office in the arena. Worse, rumor had it he planned to assassinate the 2 newly elected consuls as part of the ceremony. This was the final, unforgivable act. For the Roman elite, the consulship was a sacred link to the Republic. To have the emperor, already a disgrace, assume that office dressed as a slave fighter was a humiliation they couldn't bear. To do it from the gladiator barracks was to declare that his true home wasn't the imperial palace but the filthy quarters of society's outcasts. Cassius Dio writes that omens foretold his death. On his last day, his helmet was carried out through the gate of death, the exit used to drag away corpses. For the conspirators around him, the message was clear. They had to act, not just to save their own lives, but to save Rome from this final spectacle. The New Year's Day plan could not be allowed to happen. The gladiator emperor had given his last performance. The plot that finally brought Commodus down was an inside job, hatched by those closest to him. His praetorian prefect, Laetus, his chamberlain, Eclectus, and his favorite concubine, a woman named Marcia. Their motive was simple: self-preservation. In his paranoia, Commodus had drawn up a kill list. Marcia found it and was horrified to see her own name at the top, along with Laetus and Eclectus. Faced with certain death, they decided to strike first. Narcissus was sent into the emperor's chambers. He found the 31-year-old emperor in his bath, probably still sick from the wine. There, in the steam of the imperial bathing complex, the emperor who played at being a fighter met a real one. The wrestler Narcissus lunged at his master and strangled him to death. The Roman Hercules, the self-proclaimed god, died not in glorious combat, but choked to death by his own trainer. The death of Commodus immediately plunged Rome into chaos, kicking off the bloody year of the 5 emperors. His story is one of the most shocking in Roman history, a terrifying example of how one man's madness could destabilize an entire empire. If you want to dive into more stories of Roman ambition, intrigue, and insanity, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments, which Roman emperor's story should we uncover next? When news of Commodus's death reached the Senate, the reaction wasn't grief, but pure, euphoric relief. They immediately declared him a public enemy and issued a damnatio memoriae, a damnation of memory. This was the ultimate punishment. His name was to be scraped off all public buildings, his laws were voided, and his statues were torn down across the empire. They tried to erase any trace that the gladiator emperor had ever existed. But you can't truly erase history. Commodus's reign is remembered as the disastrous end of the Pax Romana, the 2 centuries of peace that marked the height of the Roman Empire. He inherited a kingdom of gold and, through neglect, cruelty, and spectacular self-indulgence, left behind one of iron and rust. His story is more than just a lurid tale of a mad emperor. It reveals the dark relationship between the Roman ruler and the Roman people, an empire built on military might but held together by bloody entertainment. Commodus didn't invent the Roman love for violent spectacle. He merely embodied it in its most extreme form. By stepping into the arena, he ripped away the mask of imperial dignity and exposed the brutal truth at the heart of his empire, that the ultimate power was the power over life and death, and the ultimate spectacle was watching a man kill. The emperor had become the gladiator, and in doing so, he showed the world that Rome itself was the greatest and most deadly arena of all. If you thought Commodus disgracing the throne by fighting as a gladiator was shocking, wait until you hear about the emperor who made death itself into a circus. A ruler who sat on a golden throne and who buried 5,000 alive. Click the link above to witness the reign of terror of the general who buried 5,000 alive, the terrifying siege of Nineveh.